I'm Linda Moore, 68 years old. And this morning, I realized what I'd become in my own son's home. The smell of burnt coffee filled the kitchen as I knelt on the floor, watching a brown stain spread across white marble like a confession I hadn't meant to make. My daughter-in-law's heels clicked behind me, sharp and certain. While her voice carried the same cold perfection as her house, I wasn't her guest anymore. I was the help. It's strange how quickly love can shrink into obligation. 2 years ago, I was a wife, a homeowner, someone who hosted Sunday dinners. Now, I'm an invisible figure in someone else's routine, scrubbing countertops I never chose, trying not to take up space. When I looked up, sunlight hit the window in a way that reminded me of the mornings my husband, Robert, used to hum while making breakfast. Back then, the sound of a coffee pot meant comfort. Today, it meant servitude. If you've ever been made to feel small in a place that was supposed to be safe, you'll understand me. Let me take you back to how I ended up here kneeling on cold marble, learning what it means to lose your home while still having a roof over your head. After Robert passed away, the world went quiet in a way I'd never known before. The house we built together, our little cape in the suburbs, suddenly felt too big, too still. Every creak at night echoed like a reminder that I was alone. I thought my son, Eric, would be my anchor through that storm. He told me it would be easier if I sold the house and moved in with him and Tessa. At the time, it sounded like care. Now, I know it was control wrapped in concern. I remember watching strangers carry my life into a moving truck, 40 years of photographs, dishes, furniture. I told myself it was temporary, just until I felt steady again. But when the last box left the driveway, I realized I wasn't just losing a house. I was losing the only space where I still felt like myself. At first, living with them seemed kind enough. Eric smiled more when Tessa was around. She even cooked my favorite stew once. But soon my wedding china didn't fit the decor, and my pictures of Robert were quietly packed away because they clashed with her modern walls. Little pieces of me disappeared, until all that was left was a polite version of myself, someone who didn't belong but didn't complain. I told myself it was just an adjustment. Grief does strange things to people. I had no idea the real storm hadn't even started yet. The longer I stayed, the smaller my world became. What began as small gestures of help slowly turned into quiet orders. At first, it was just washing a few dishes, folding a load of laundry. Then it became scrubbing floors, ironing napkins, cooking dinner for 3, while pretending I wasn't hungry myself. It happened so gradually that by the time I realized I was working, not living, it was too late to protest without sounding ungrateful. I told myself it was normal. Families share space, share effort. But in this house, effort only moved one way. Tessa had a way of turning every request into a judgment, each sigh, a reminder that I was no longer a guest, but an inconvenience that needed managing. Eric noticed. I think. He'd look away whenever her tone cut a little too sharp. It hurt more that he didn't defend me than anything she ever said. On the morning of her birthday, I was up before sunrise, polishing the silverware and steaming the tablecloth. My hands ached. But I told myself it was fine. She was hosting an important dinner that night, some career-making event with her CEO client. I wanted to keep the peace. I wanted to believe kindness would find its way back. As I looked around the spotless kitchen, I didn't know yet that the doorbell ringing at 7 o'clock that evening would change everything. At exactly 7 o'clock that evening, the doorbell rang. My heart was pounding harder than it should have. I wiped my hands on my apron, straightened the navy dress I'd worn to Eric and Tessa's wedding years ago, and opened the door. The man standing there looked polished. Confident silver hair, steady eyes, the air of someone who owned every room he entered. But the moment his gaze met mine, everything around us froze. I saw the color drain from his face. The briefcase slipped slightly in his hand. I didn't breathe. I hadn't seen Grant Whitaker in nearly 4 decades. Yet the years vanished in an instant. Every buried emotion, shame, anger, heartbreak rose to the surface. For a moment, I thought I might faint, but I forced myself to stand tall. Behind me, I heard the familiar rhythm of Tessa's heels approaching, her voice light and professional, welcoming him into her home. Completely unaware of the history standing between us, I stepped aside, letting him pass as if he were any other guest. Inside, the air felt electric. He avoided my eyes, and I focused on my breathing, on not letting the tremor in my hands betray me. I moved quietly to hang his coat. My reflection, catching in the hallway mirror, an old woman now, but not invisible anymore. It was strange how time could fold in on itself. How one face could drag you back to a version of yourself you thought had died. I told myself to keep calm. The night had only begun. As I moved through the hallway, carrying his coat to the closet, my mind slipped backward, years collapsing into one painful memory. Grant Whitaker. Back then, he wasn't a CEO with graying temples and a tailored suit. He was a young attorney with ambition in his smile and promises in his voice. I was 29, a paralegal working endless hours, trying to pay for Eric's medical bills after his accident. I used to believe he cared. For a while, maybe he did. But when his wife found out, he protected his reputation. Not the truth. He let me take the blame, and the firm made sure I'd never work in law again. One accusation was all it took to erase everything I'd built. That was the day I stopped being Margaret Stevens, legal professional, and became Linda Moore, the nurse who learned how to survive. I buried that past so deeply I thought it would never touch me again. Yet, here he was, sitting in my daughter-in-law's living room, sipping wine, pretending not to know me. And there I was, serving canapés to the man who'd once destroyed my name. I told myself to breathe, to keep steady hands. But inside, something old had cracked open, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to close it again. I spent the next hour moving silently between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying plates and glasses like a shadow no one acknowledged. Tessa's laughter floated through the air, bright and brittle, filling every pause that might have left room for me. She spoke about marketing strategies, luxury clients, and expansion plans, her words sparkling with ambition. I kept my focus on the roast, the silverware, the rhythm of serving. Anything but the man who sat across from her. Grant's presence pressed on me like a weight I couldn't shift. Every time I entered the room, I felt his eyes on me, careful but unrelenting. When Tessa called me by name, she said it like an order, not an acknowledgement. I smiled when required, though my chest was tight with memories I'd spent decades burying. As I gathered plates, I caught a glimpse of him through the reflection in the cabinet glass. His expression wasn't arrogance anymore, it was regret. The kind that arrives too late to fix what's been broken. When I turned to leave, he rose quietly and followed me toward the hallway. I didn't have to hear the words to know what he wanted to talk, to explain, to unravel the silence that had lasted nearly 40 years. But I wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. I told myself to keep moving, to finish the night, and to hold everything inside until I was safely alone again. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the house smelled of candle wax and leftover champagne, I stood at the sink washing dishes I hadn't eaten from. The water was warm, but my hands still shook. I felt hollow, like someone had scraped me clean from the inside. Eric appeared in the doorway, still in his shirt and tie, his eyes tired but kind. He tried to sound casual, asking if everything had gone smoothly, if Tessa was happy with the dinner. I could see the guilt sitting behind his eyes, heavy and silent. For a moment, I thought he might finally say what I'd needed to hear, that he saw how I was being treated, that he wanted to make it right. But all that came was a vague promise to create a better system for chores. As if my exhaustion could be fixed by a schedule. I nodded, letting him believe it was enough. Sometimes silence is easier than disappointment. When he went upstairs, I wiped the counters one last time before walking to the front door. Grant was waiting there, coat in hand, the night air curling around him. His eyes held a mix of remorse and something else, something that looked like recognition of all the years between us. He thanked me for the evening, his tone polite, professional, but before stepping out, he hesitated. I could feel unspoken words pressing between us, and I turned away before he could release them. After the door closed, I stood there for a long while. My reflection in the glass looked older, but behind the wrinkles, I saw the faint outline of the woman I used to be. That night, as I lay in bed, one thought wouldn't leave me. Years ago, when Eric was a child, an anonymous donation had paid for his surgery, the one that saved his leg. I had never known who sent it. But now, after tonight, I had a terrible, impossible guess. The next morning, the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Tessa had already left for work, leaving her breakfast dishes in the sink, a small reminder of my place in this house. I moved slowly through my chores, each motion mechanical, my mind looping through fragments of last night. The look in Grant's eyes, the way his voice trembled when he saw me, the way Eric avoided them both, like pretending ignorance could erase discomfort. As I folded a towel, my gaze landed on an old photo of Eric when he was 8 years old, his smile wide, his leg still bandaged after surgery. That operation had saved his childhood. For years, I'd believed the help had come from a hospital fund or a kind stranger. But now, I couldn't stop wondering. What if that stranger had a familiar face? What if the man who once ruined me had quietly tried to save me afterward? The thought made my chest tighten, not from forgiveness, but from confusion. I didn't know which hurt more, the past betrayal or the possibility of misplaced gratitude. Around 10:30 that morning, the phone rang. A local number. I hesitated before answering. It was him, Grant. His voice was calm but strained, asking if I had time to meet, saying there were things I needed to know about what really happened all those years ago. At first, I wanted to hang up. My instinct screamed to protect what little peace I had left. But then he mentioned my name, Margaret, not Maggie, and something in me froze. No one had called me that in decades. He said there were truths I'd never been told. That what I believed about that day, about my firing, wasn't the whole story. I told him I wasn't interested. That nothing he said could undo what was done. But even after I hung up, his words clung to me like a scent I couldn't wash off. That afternoon, I found myself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the gray sky. I didn't know if I was ready to face the man who'd broken me. But deep down, I knew I would. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried until you look them in the eye. When I finally agreed to meet Grant, it wasn't out of forgiveness. It was curiosity. Maybe closure. Maybe both. We chose a small cafe near the library. The kind of place where no one asks questions and the smell of coffee feels like home. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window in a gray suit that looked a little too sharp for the worn leather booths. His hair was more silver than I remembered, but his eyes, they hadn't changed. There was a heaviness in them, like a man carrying the weight of 4 decades. I sat across from him, keeping my hands wrapped around my coffee cup just to stop them from trembling. He started talking before I could decide whether I wanted to hear it. He said he'd spent years replaying the past, what he did, what he didn't do, what he wished he could undo. He told me the reason he'd stayed silent all those years ago wasn't just to protect himself. His wife had been pregnant at the time. The stress, he said, had nearly caused her to lose the baby. She'd threatened to harm herself if he admitted the affair was mutual. I wanted to hate him for saying that. I wanted to call it an excuse, but the look on his face stopped me. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was confessing. Then he said something that made my breath catch. He'd known about the surgery for Eric, the one we could never afford. The anonymous donation that saved my son's leg that had been him. My nursing school tuition. The hospital bills. Even a few contracts that had kept my late husband's small business afloat, he had arranged those quietly. Over the years, without ever revealing his name. Hearing that didn't erase the pain, but it rearranged it. It turned my anger into something messier, something closer to grief for the life that could have been, had he made different choices. He said he wanted to offer me a job. Not charity, he promised, but a real position. Something that would let me stand on my own again. I didn't answer right away. I told him I'd think about it. As I walked home through the cold air, my mind kept circling back to his words, not the apology. Not even the offer. But the quiet truth that sometimes, the people who hurt us the most also carry their guilt for a lifetime. And I wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. 2 days later, I was polishing the living room table when Eric came home early. He looked exhausted, tie loosened, shoulders heavy. I could tell something in him was breaking. Even before he spoke, he said he'd been thinking about how things had become in the house. How Tessa treated me. How he'd stayed silent for far too long. For the first time in months, he looked at me not as his mother who needed care, but as a person who deserved respect. That moment alone made my heart ache in ways I hadn't expected. I told him about the meeting with Grant. About the offer. About everything I'd learned, the betrayal. The guilt. And the quiet ways he'd tried to make things right. Eric didn't say much. He just listened. The way his father used to when something heavy was sitting in my chest. And then, as if fate had been listening, the doorbell rang. It was Grant. Standing there, holding flowers and determination. Before I could say a word, Tessa came in from the hallway, eyes wide when she saw him. She demanded to know what he was doing there, and when I said he'd come to discuss a job offer, her expression turned sharp, half disbelief, half mockery. She said I wasn't qualified for anything more than housework, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head. Something in me snapped then. 18 months of humiliation boiled over. I told her exactly who I was, what I'd accomplished, what I had survived. Grant didn't try to stop me. He simply said I was one of the most capable women he knew, and the position he was offering required strength and integrity qualities I'd proven I had. The shock on Tessa's face was almost cinematic, but the silence that followed from Eric was what mattered. When he finally spoke, he told his wife she had gone too far. I realized then that my son wasn't blind, just afraid, and for the first time, he was choosing courage. I accepted the job. I told them both I would be moving out by the weekend. As I packed that night, I wasn't angry anymore. I felt free. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself not out of pride, but out of peace. And deep down, I knew this was the beginning of a completely new life. Moving day came with a kind of quiet sunlight that felt like a blessing. I remember standing by the open window of my new apartment, breathing in air that finally felt like it belonged to me. The place wasn't large, just a small one-bedroom downtown, but it was mine. My own furniture, my own walls, my own peace. Eric helped me carry the last few boxes up the stairs. He looked tired, but lighter somehow, like a man who had finally stopped pretending everything at home was fine. We didn't talk much as we unpacked. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any apology could. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. He told me that seeing me stand up for myself had changed the way he looked at his own life, his own marriage, his own choices. It made me realize that sometimes, Strength is contagious. Grant stopped by later that afternoon. He brought a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Though neither of us was sure if celebration was the right word. It wasn't romantic, at least. Not yet. It was more like mutual respect. 2 people who had finally stopped running from their pasts. The first week at the new job was overwhelming in the best way. Real work. Real challenges. My name on an office door again after all those years. I found myself rediscovering the sharpness I'd once buried beneath laundry and grocery lists. Clients respected me. Colleagues came to me for advice. For the first time in decades. I wasn't someone's mother-in-law or charity case, I was Maggie Hart. Senior Client Relations Manager. Months passed. And with every passing day, I felt more like myself. Eric's marriage didn't survive. Tessa eventually left. Unable to handle the fact that he'd chosen integrity over convenience. But he was healing too. Building something more honest from the pieces that remained. Sometimes Grant would stop by my office to talk about work or life, and I'd catch that same look in his eyes. Regret. Yes. But also admiration. I never knew what our future might hold. But for once, I wasn't afraid to find out. At 68, I'd learned that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to forgive, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. And if you've ever been made to feel small, remember this, your story isn't over until you decide it is. If this story touched you, share it. Someone out there might need to be reminded that it's never too late to begin again.